Hello again. We're going to finish this lecture on aggression, conflict, alliances, and conflict resolution. So this is our last video for this lecture, and we're going to focus on conflict resolution in this video. And for this part of the lecture, I want you to read this article by DeWall on primates. It's a model of conflict resolution, and I'm going to take most of this lecture material from this article. Chances are there'll be a test question based on this article as well. Okay, so let's get us to our PowerPoint. If I can find it. Okay, here we are. So we have talked about different components of aggression and alliances that formed during aggressive interactions. We've talked about game theory, but now we want to think about what happens after a conflict or after aggression, if you will. And so we know that there are individuals face conflicts of interest all the time, and sometimes aggression is a consequence of a conflict of interest. Now, a lot of researchers back in the 1900s, mid-1900s, particularly modeled after Lorenz's ideas, suggested that aggression stems from individuals, and they developed what's called the individual model of aggression. And aggression basically is the outcome in this model, is the outcome of frustration. An individual is frustrated because of some pain that's been inflicted, or an individual is influenced by TV, a model, or something they've learned, or alcohol, or hormones, or some sort of aggressive drive or genetics that drives this individual to be aggressive. Problem with this model is, well, actually there are several problems with this model. Okay, it tells us a little bit about the causes of aggression. It seems that aggression is an instinct, an automatic response to frustration. But this model focuses on an individual outside of its social context. We need to be thinking about this individual within its social context. This model focuses on how aggression starts, but not on the outcome of aggression or its consequences or how it's controlled. This model doesn't make good predictions about conflict resolution, doesn't really focus on conflict resolution, and it might even make bad predictions about what should happen after aggression. So in this model, if an individual is aggressive, you might predict or shows aggression toward another individual, an opponent. You might predict that the individual would avoid the opponent, right? Because they were just mad at them. They just just fought with that opponent. And actually, the evidence suggests just the opposite. So the individual model of aggression predicts that individuals involved in aggressive behavior should space out after a conflict, get away from it, right? That's not really the case. In most primates, we see something very different happening, and this is kind of an interesting graph. It's kind of awkward, but what we're looking at here is a situation after a conflict. This is post-conflict, PC, versus a matched controls time when there wasn't a conflict. And the researchers have looked at the percent of individuals who pair up, who come together again after a conflict or in a matched control. And you can see this over time. We're looking kind of at the cumulative percent. So basically, when there's conflict, the animals are more likely to come back together after that conflict than they are in a matched control time period. This is not predicted by the individual model at all. So why are they doing this? Can we come up with a better model for aggression? Franz DeWall, who's kind of the guru of primates, has studied primates for years and years and is, all thing primate. And he came up with what's called the relational model of aggression based on his work on primates, but it's extending now. This is a little bit older article that I asked you to read. His work is extending into other areas, and it's certainly extended into humans as well now. But he says the relational model of aggression goes something like this. We've got two individuals with a conflict of interest. And yes, this could be two countries or something like that as well. But let's focus on individuals, and it's likely these individuals know each other. They might be members of the same family or same group or same community, because most aggression, frankly, happens at that level. And they have a conflict of interest. Maybe they both want the same resource. Maybe they're both seeking the same mate or the same food or something like that. There's kind of three different outcomes, if you will, or ways to resolve this conflict of interest. Some parties might simply be more tolerant. They might decide to share the resource. So in some species, we get a lot of tolerance. And a second way to deal with a conflict of interest is to avoid each other. Okay, we'll divide the resource, and this is my territory and that's your territory, and we're just going to avoid each other. Or there could be aggression, a fight over the resource that you're interested in. And when there's a fight, typically there's a winner and a loser. But then after that fight, and I can almost put an arrow between this aggression and reconciliation, there's often reconciliation, some sort of way to repair the damage done by that aggression. And the model suggests that if individuals 1 and 2 are in some way interested in repairing the relationship, there will be reconciliation. And typically, individuals engaged in conflict have a relationship. They may even have a very close relationship with each other, but they've gotten into a fight, and there's a strong drive to repair the damage done by that fight. If there's any kind of merging of interest or continue, they might want to continue their cooperation. They have been cooperating with each other all along. They are giving each other mutual aid, and it's in their best interest, if you will, to reconcile after a fight. That's the relational model. So we get some different kinds of predictions than the original individual model. So maybe we need to think about what is reconciliation then. If the relational model suggests that when aggression happens, reconciliation is likely to follow, especially if individuals who are the individuals engaged in the fight have a close relationship or have other interests in common. So what is it then? What does it involve? What are the outcomes of reconciliation? Well, reconciliation can simply be described as a friendly reunion between former opponents shortly after a fight. Or we could say it's conflict settlement, forgiveness in humans, we might say. Reconciliation serves to restore the relationship, to repair damage done. What does it involve? Typically, it involves seeking out the former opponent, finding the former opponent. Maybe it involves, in primates, grooming behavior, contact, kissing, hugging, holding hands. This is what reconciliation is about, seeking each other out. And what's the outcome? Typically, the restoration of the relationship. That relationship is restored. And in addition, you see a reduction in stress levels of both the winner of the conflict and the victim of the conflict. How do researchers know that? Well, researchers look at displacement activities in primates. Displacement activities are activities that the animals do when they're anxious. And they typically involve self-grooming, self-scratching, vocalizations, and researchers are finding that after reconciliation, those displacement activities drop in both winners and in victims of fights. Okay. But here are a few questions that this article raised. So, would you expect reconciliation to occur more frequently among closely related macaque females or among unrelated macaque females? Well, according to this model suggests that individuals with mutual interests in maintaining a close relationship are more likely to reconcile. So I'm going to go with closely related individuals, and in fact that's what they find. And here's something interesting. Researchers are finding that closely related, in this case macaques, are more likely to fight than unrelated macaques. And think about this in your own family. You're much more likely to fight with your sibling or spouse than you are with your neighbor. Why is that? Researchers suggest that it happens because there is a close relationship, that there is security in the relationship, and it's okay to engage in mild aggressive interactions because it's likely the aggression will be reconciled or the conflict will be reconciled in the near future. Can cycles of conflict and reconciliation be used to shape or reshape relationships? So can conflict and reconciliation actually change behavior and change relationships? We think so. Yeah, we think so. Here's an example of a situation in which reconciliation and conflict and then reconciliation has changed behavior. So if you look at, and this is in a variety of primates, if you look at mother and infant relationships, infant is nursing, right? And they have a very close relationship. At some point, mother primate wants to wean her infant and maybe engage in future reproductive activities, right? And infant primate doesn't want that. There's a conflict of interest. Infant wants to keep nursing forever, and this conflict of interest can lead to temper tantrums by the infant, aggression, relatively mild, but acts of aggression. What happens over time, after reconciliation and conflict again, and reconciliation and conflict, what happens over time is the relationship changes a little bit. Soon, the infant finds some other way to be close to mom without nursing, and maybe engage in like sucking on mom's lip, or sucking on a flap of skin in mom, or just hanging tightly onto mom rather than nursing. And so the relationship is changing as a result of these cycles of conflict and resolution, conflict and reconciliation, over and over and over again. Reconciliation. It's pretty interesting. Is there any evidence that reconciliation is a learned skill and not a hardwired one? Yes, it seems there is. So there are close relatives of each other, macaque monkeys, the rhesus monkeys, and the stumptails. Rhesus monkeys aren't so good at reconciling. Stumptail macaques are highly conciliatory. They reconcile all the time. And it turns out if you raise rhesus monkeys with stumptail macaques, they become much more conciliatory than other rhesus monkey juveniles. They're much more likely to reconcile than others. And the community becomes one in which they are part of, becomes one of more reconciliation. So we can see here, this is an example of how behavior can be modified by social experience. Reconciliation is something that is a skill that's learned. It takes practice. It's kind of cool. And there's a lot of complexity in reconciliation. Typically, you've got two individuals engaged in conflict. They fight, and then they reconcile. But sometimes there are other members of the group that participate in reconciliation. So there's something called triadic reconciliation, in which a relative helps out. So, maybe a mother primate sees her daughter as a victim of aggression by a male in the troop. She may approach the male and try to reconcile the situation by grooming him or something like that. A third-party mediation is a little different. This happens when an individual who's not necessarily related tries to bring together two individuals who've just had a fight. Chimpanzees do this, where a female will, after two males are in the troop are fighting with each other, she will try to bring them together by grooming each one separately and essentially trying to get them closer together so that they can reconcile. And then there's policing and pacification, which occurs when high-ranking individuals kind of get involved and become the peacemakers, trying to sort out and to break up fights, to allow reconciliation to happen. So there's often, even in our non-human primates, there are often others involved in the community is probably going to benefit by reconciliation of members within that community or within that population. So what's the function of reconciliation? Well, this seems obvious, right? To repair damage, to restore relationships, and sometimes even to help modify relationships or convert them into or change them. This protects the cooperative bonds in a social group. Absolutely. It seems critical to maintaining cooperation within the group, which is going to benefit individuals. It lowers stress and tension, and probably with lower stress levels, you get less disease and sickness. So this has kind of long-ranging effects, or wide-ranging effects, I should say, right? What are the costs of reconciliation? They're probably pretty low. It doesn't take a lot to engage in reconciliation. You have to be able to recognize individuals in the group, and fighters may start fighting again, but reconciliation isn't costly. It isn't expensive in any sense of the word. And so, what about humans and reconciliation? And I'm talking now in January, and I'm doing this recording in January, and our country is wildly divided over politics, right? Even within families and within friend groups, our country is just incredibly divided. It's divided over the global pandemic and what we need to do about this pandemic. We are in a very divisive place in which there's conflict of interest all over the place. Do we use this relational model of reconciliation? It turns out we do. And a lot of research has been studied in children, school-age children. How do they go about dealing with a conflict of interest and a fight that breaks out? Because clearly conflicts are often dealt with by fighting in school-age children, right? But they tend to resolve conflicts by working things out on the spot. Or maybe they take a break from each other and then they have a friendly reunion, right? And conflict resolution tends to decrease aggression, decrease stress, increase tolerance in children. We also find that conflict resolution is more likely to happen in friends, in individuals who've already been friendly beforehand. And it's learned by your interactions with your peers, with your siblings in particular. So think of all the times that you've fought with your siblings and then had to resolve that conflict by reconciliation. Yeah, that's all that practice is, a valuable practice. As adults, well, this relational model reconciliation hasn't been studied as much, but clearly it's critical for human society at the level of, families, at the level of neighborhoods or communities, at the level of countries, right? Some acts of aggression seem to occur outside our social context and outside of this relational model, like warfare or random shootings, things of that nature. Those seem kind of not to fit into this model. But we certainly study how do we go about reconciling? What do we do for reconciliation at work or within our marriages or within our families? And this relational model is in fact one that makes sense. It fits with what we are like too. And so it's kind of an interesting and really good model, I think, to follow. At the end, there's hope for us humans because all of the conflict of interest that's happening in our country worries us. It gives us stress. It increases that stress load. It increases our likelihood of getting sick with increased stress. And we worry about this. Chuck Silverstein comes up with a good version of reconciliation. I will not play at tug of war. I'd rather play at hug of war, where everyone hugs instead of tugs, where everyone giggles and rolls on the rug, where everyone kisses and everyone grins, everyone cuddles and everyone wins. That's from Where the Sidewalk Ends. Reconciliation is clearly functional in the animal community. It seems to be a natural kind of outcome of aggression, and it probably happens in many, many animal species, not just primates, but many animal species use reconciliation as a way to restore relationships that are so important for cooperation. We're going to be focusing on cooperation in our next lecture, so we'll see you there.